and we will get started. Folks read a little bit about your research and your career and what you do to kind of prepare questions. I also have pre-written questions from some of the students that won't be here. But if you'd like to just refresh our memories, give us just a real quick introduction to who you are, and we can kind of go from there.
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I have not joined for this class before, so I'm happy to be here. So my name is Kate Ratliff. I am an associate professor in the Department of Psychology here at UF. I am in the social psychology group. So we are generally very research focused. So we're kind of different from our counseling or clinical psychology counterparts. And that we primarily just teach and do research as academic social psychologists. I have been here at UF for 10 years. Before that, I worked for 3 years as a faculty member at the University of Tilburg, which is in the Netherlands. And then before that, I was finishing grad school. So I did my graduate work at the University of Virginia, and I got my PhD there in 2009, also in social psychology. Yeah, that's kind of my general bio. Do you want me to say something about research or just wait for questions?
But we can go ahead and go to questions.
Okay.
While people are kind of settling in, I actually have a good one from the online group, which I think is probably a good starter question.
Okay.
From Ashton Williams. What qualities and qualifications do you look for in a research assistant, and what is one piece of advice you would give to someone who's just getting started in the research process or trying to get involved in research?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one thing to know about, so all of you, can I just ask really quick?
Yes.
You're in all different majors, right? Okay, so all different kinds of majors. Okay. So my answer is sort of constrained by my background in psychology. And it's often hard to get into research labs because there are just more psychology undergraduates who want to work in research labs than there are faculty. So one thing that I'll say, it's not exactly related to the question, but don't be discouraged if you end up working in a lab that's not exactly what you want to do. I think that most of the time when you apply to graduate school, they want to see that you have, if you decide to do that, that you have some research experience, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in exactly what it is that you want to be doing. So if you're I really want to work with so-and-so doing this certain topic, because that's what I want to do with my career, and you can't get into that lab, just try to get into any lab is the basic point, right? Get some research experience. So I think that's one piece of information, just advice is just do research somewhere. You'll learn something, right, from whoever you work with. In terms of what I personally am looking for, I generally just look for enthusiasm and people who can articulate why they want to be a research assistant, not just oh, I heard this is something you're supposed to do, but they have some interest in the topic and can sort of say this is why I want to do research. And again, even if it's not in the same area, I don't necessarily look for people who want to be social psychologists, just people who are I'm interested in what your lab does. And that's really kind of our main thing. And honestly, if I'm being totally honest, a lot of it is really just first come, first serve. So start asking early. So for, the fall, early summer, start asking people if there are positions open in the fall. Because I'll often just say yes to the first 10 people who ask, and then I don't have any more spots. And I know there are a few other faculty members who sort of do it that way, because I don't feel, so I study bias. I don't feel like I actually know what predicts success. And so it doesn't feel fair to say oh, I'm going to use GPA or I'm going to use XYZ, because those things don't actually predict all that much. So I sort of just go with whoever asks.
Awesome. Yeah.
I have a question regarding, this is a little bit from the technical or logistics side of research in regards to grants and getting funding for research. This is something that's come up in my mind for later in research. What portion, how important, what portion of your work consists of applying for grants and trying to find a grant for the research, and how relevant that is to your career?
Yes. So in general, it is pretty relevant, and it's becoming increasingly relevant. So, even in the 10 years I've been here at UF, I've seen sort of a shift where I think like the hard sciences, chemists, biologists have always been sort of really heavily reliant on grants. We haven't had to do that as much in psychology historically, but it is becoming more and more important. When I was hired, the sort of, way my position was written was like my tenure decision was based on sort of trying to secure grants. I think now people who are hired, it's a little bit more explicit that you have to successfully get grants to get tenure. So that's changing a little bit over time. I have a grant now, so I have been grant funded most of the time, but I tend to apply for pretty small grants because the work I do just doesn't require the kinds of like equipment and resources that like a chemist would need. So yeah, increasingly important, but I don't think that's something that undergrads need to worry about too much. There's maybe good if you were to apply to grad school and say, I worked in a lab that had grant funding just to show that you kind of know what that means, but I don't think it's super.
Yeah, Eileen?
I have a question about your project implicit.
Yes.
So we actually learned a little bit about implicit bias in high school, specifically how implicit bias plays a large role in microaggressions.
Yep.
And especially those towards like races and genders. How would you be like with project implicit? How would you be able to study such implicit biases and be able to promote a lifestyle that's sorry, I wrote it down. Promote a lifestyle where people are aware of their microaggressions towards others. So how would you use project implicit to like promote that idea?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So just to give like a tiny bit of background for those of you who don't know, my research is shifting a bit, but it's mostly been focused on implicit bias, which are basically biases that come out sort of automatically or unintentionally based on things like race, gender, socioeconomic status, etc. So the idea is that, because of some of the messages that we've learned in society, many of us have internalized these kinds of biases that then can influence what it is that we do. One example, I guess, might be a microaggression. And so at Project Implicit, by the way, is a nonprofit. I was also executive director of Project Implicit for several years while I was here at UF, and recently have stepped down from that role, but I'm still on the board of directors and I do a lot of my research with Project Implicit. So it's a nonprofit. The main kind of piece of Project Implicit is this educational website where people can go to do tests to learn about their own implicit biases and to get sort of experience and examples of implicit bias. We get, between 4 and 6 million visitors a year. So the other piece of this is that we get tons of data. So lots of the papers that I publish are using data from people who have come to the Project Implicit website. And the idea is that they get some kind of educational experience and we get their data to answer questions about bias. And so, I think, it's not an interactive experience, right? You just go, you're at a website. So there's only so much we can do at the website, but I think the goal for the website really is just purely education, that it's sort of like making people have these experiences where, they can sort of feel the biases that they have and how that might impact their performance on the various tasks that we have. So I wouldn't say that there's anything that's like necessarily designed to like, I don't know, mitigate bias or to, make people behave differently specifically. The idea is just to make people aware of these biases so that they know why they need to go kind of seek additional information or, figure it out, basically. Yeah.
A follow-up question to that.
Sure.
So actually, I noticed I was going to try to do the project implicit test, but I'm 17, so I wasn't able to do
That's
that.
new.
So my question regards the age. So a lot of conceptions about like certain genders, races. I basically ideology comes from a lot like parents, other adult figures in lives. So if it's like say a minor, like a teenager, if they were to learn about their microaggressions, is there like a different is there a way for them to learn about their implicit biases before they can even qualify for project implicit?
Yeah. So, the sort of pragmatic situation here is that about 2 years ago, we switched our IRB, which is our human subjects ethics protocol, from one university to another. So we moved it from Harvard to the University of Virginia, and University of Virginia has been very clear that we have to have an age gate. And until then, we had actually been collecting data on anybody who came to the site. They just had to say like, yeah, my parent or guardian knows that I'm doing this, but UVA won't let us do that anymore. So that's why there's now this like age gate. You know, technically it's a learning experience, but it also is human subjects research. So their point was basically that like, you know, you have to be able to legally consent to participate in research. So we actually have a lot of data from people under 18. And as far as I know, we can still look at those data. We just can't collect any new data on people who are younger.
Hi, I really enjoyed reading a bit about the education program because I'm also into psychology and but also like education and how we can make childhood better, basically, right?
Right.
So would this be a good teaching tool potentially, or something like this be implemented in the classroom? Like, is there any kind of like maybe push towards that thought to where it would be like, okay, well, let's sit some kids down while we're trying to teach other, like, you know, you have to teach about racism or you have to teach about other biases. So why don't like we sit down with kids? But I think there's now the whatever 7 law where
Right.
that might not even be on the table at that point.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the particular tests that we use at Project Implicit, there are several of them, but the kind of main, most frequent test that we use is something called the implicit association test, or the IAT. And a lot of my research for the last few years has been looking at how to use the IAT as part of an educational program. And it can be effective. It's not really effective in getting people to like, you know, have this like radical change of heart, right? Very few kind of one-off educational experiences do that. But it has been really effective to get people to just sort of recognize the limits of their own minds, right? And to recognize that like, maybe when I'm making decisions, there's more to it than I realize. So it's kind of a good like foot in the door test, I think, just to get people sort of thinking about how they might have biases that they're not fully aware of, or that, you know, might come out in ways that they don't want. And we have data showing this, right, that it can be pretty effective for that kind of education. As far as the laws, it's unclear, honestly, where implicit bias falls. I would say that it's a topic pretty different from, you know, mandatory anti-racism training, whatever the things are that are specifically outlawed. I think it's not quite that, but some people interpret it that way. So it's a little bit up in the air right now, whether these kinds of educational sessions can continue or not.
Yeah,
I think this is off topic too much. Can you mention that you went to your PhD at University of Virginia as opposed to the Netherlands?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so you probably, many of you, not all of you, I don't want to assume your ages, many of you might be too young to remember or not have paid attention, but in 2008, 2009, the US economy just like completely collapsed. That was the year that I was getting my PhD, and there really just like were no jobs. Like there were entire states like Florida, for example, shut down hiring in the entire state of Florida. Like I remember applying for a job at actually at Florida State, and getting basically a message saying like, sorry, turns out the state of Florida is doing no hiring at all. Same with California. So there were just really, really not that many jobs. And I saw an ad for a job in the Netherlands, and I like kind of spur of the moment applied. And then I got an interview and I went and I loved it. I really, really liked it. You know, at the time I went straight from undergrad to grad school. So I finished, I was like 27, 28. And it seemed like a good time to just like go live somewhere outside of the US for a while. So I did it for 3 years. At some point I started feeling like, you know, my parents are getting older and I have nieces and nephews, and felt like I was like missing out on some of that. So I came back, but it was a good plan for a few years. And I have colleagues who are also from the US who started there at the same time as me, who are still there, who just have stayed. So.
I was wondering, so I also am interested in psychology, but I feel like I have like a very broad idea of like what I want to be doing. Like, I'm just kind of interested in all of it. So how are you able to like triangulate exactly what you wanted to go into? Like, was there something that kind of drove you to make this like your research interest?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that, you know, as much as you can just take like the 3,000 level classes, the better. So there's like intro to social psychology, intro to developmental psychology, intro to counseling. So like we have 5 areas in our department, and each of them offers just sort of a foundational course in that general area. So I think that's a good way just to sort of see what the different areas are. I think all of them have sort of an online and an in-person option for each of those classes. For me, I was a double major in sociology. And so social psychology was sort of the thing that kind of bridged psychology and sociology the most. And so that's kind of the path I went down. I was really involved in college in anti-death penalty work, and just sort of a variety of kind of social justice kinds of issues. And so social psychology felt like a way for me to do science, which I really liked, but also apply it to things that like I really cared about. So, yeah.
I was wondering if your research like, in your PhD program like kind of aligns with the research that you do now, if that like progressed or if it like changed vastly in that way.
Yeah, you know, it hasn't changed much. I have started, I mentioned just a minute ago, I've started shifting gears a little bit. I feel like I've been doing implicit social cognition stuff since I started grad school in 2003. It's, you know, interesting, but I'm feeling like I'm kind of interested in some other things. So I've started shifting a little bit to looking at basically the impact of policy on intergroup attitudes. So how laws and institutional change signal something that then changes people's attitudes. But even that is still like kind of in the same realm as what I was doing before. It's just not quite as focused on the like implicit or automatic piece. But yeah, I mean, a lot of what I've been doing for the last 10 years really is like directly related to what I did in grad school.
Yeah, that's a question.
Sure.
With your work that you do now with the policy work, has it like, have you been collaborating with other departments that you have like the, I don't know, the policy and
Political science, yeah. So I have a grant right now from the National Science Foundation that one of my collaborators is another social psychologist at University of Utah. And then our third collaborator is Dan Smith, who is faculty in the Department of Political Science. Because we're basically looking at how changes in reproductive rights laws influence attitudes toward women. So he's been helping with sort of the law and policy part, and then we've been kind of doing the psychological change part. Yeah, it's been fun. Yeah.
Right.
I'll ask you guys to the audience.
Yeah.
I took one of the tests.
Yes.
And I was wondering if it was living test, because I felt like while doing the test, I realized I feel like one of those usually going the other way around. Like just react to the barrier or like the way buttons to the wrong button.
Right. But the fact that you didn't react quicker and that you didn't click the right button instead of the wrong button, that's the point in lots of ways, right? Like that's what's actually being measured during the test is when you're forced to go quickly, right? So when you're forced to, you know, do these pairings where, you know, women in career go together and men in family go together, people can't react quicker. And that's actually the indicator of the biases that people may have. So part of the way that the test works is the speed is actually really like a key part, right? So if everybody just like took all the time they wanted, then like, sure, you could stop and you could think about it. But in many ways, what the test is measuring is your ability to do those things quickly. So like, why is it easier for people to put family and women words together more quickly than it is to put, you know, family and men words together, right? That takes people longer. Because those concepts are less frequently paired together, right? Those are less associated in our long-term memory. So I think in some ways you're kind of articulating like the way the test works, right? That if you could go quicker, sure. But the fact that you can't is kind of part of the point. I'll also go ahead and tell you, because a lot of people who bring up validity want to know this, the order in which you do the pieces of the test doesn't actually matter very much. Feels like it matters, but it doesn't actually matter very much. Yeah, good question.
So I saw that several of your previous undergraduate assistants have been accepted to the graduate program.
Yeah.
So I tell them congrats. I was wondering, do you help them at all with their application process or?
Yeah.
Tips? So then what would this?
I do. Yeah, so I help them, and I think many faculty do. I help them in a number of ways. So like I generally read their materials and sort of help them craft their materials. Also, several of the people who've gotten into good programs have gotten into programs to work with people who I know. So I also try to kind of reach out personally to people who I know I have students applying to work with. Now, of course, I only do that for students who I really like believe in, right? Like that's an important piece of it, because these are small networks. And so like partly I have to, you know, my reputation matters. And if I want my next students to be able to get into programs, I have to send good students their way. You know, I think that at least in psychology, and I don't know, you know, I have one of our like good friends here, they're chemists, and whenever I talk to them about like grad school, it's like kind of a different ball game, where basically it's just like get really, really good grades and like, you know, you apply to a program. In psychology, and this is true in all of the areas of psychology, you're technically applying to the PhD program in social psychology, but you're really applying to work with a person. You need to get a person to say, I want that particular student, rather than trying to get some like admissions committee to admit you. And so generally, you know, what I advise my students is to pick the people they apply to carefully. Like, does this person really make sense? Like, are they doing the kind of work that you say in your cover letter that you want to be doing? And then basically make your research statement align with what it is that that person does. And so again, that's really, I think, specific to psychology. There might be other kinds of programs like that, but I think it's not just like, oh, I want to do chemistry or biology. It's like, I want to work at this university with this person in this lab because of this topic. And so that's really the key thing, is just like making sure that like match is there.
So one of my biggest fears when it comes to research is that the topic I want to research has already been researched to such a big extent that there's nothing for me to do. And I remember learning about implicit bias, and it seems to me that there was already so much research on it. How did you determine that there was more to be done?
Yeah, well, when I started, there was hardly any research on it. And that's one of the reasons it was so exciting. It was like the IAT had sort of just been, you know, starting to be used, and it felt like this very wide open area. So at the time, it didn't have that, and now it does. Like, it's pretty saturated. And that doesn't mean that there's not, you know, stuff to be done, but we know a lot. You know, there's a lot that people know. So, you know, I think kind of looking at like what are the new, if that's a concern, something that you're worried about, looking at kind of like what are the new trends, what are the new topics. You know, at least in psychology, we have a couple of journals that are like, they're basically like current events, right? Kinds of journals. Current directions in psychological science is one, where people write about sort of like the cutting edge kinds of research. So you could always look at something like that and sort of see like what are the new areas that people are focusing on, because those are places where there probably are still more things left to do.
Yeah, Zach.
As a researcher, how much leeway do you actually have in determining which direction you go with your research? Like, I mean, you said that you're slightly pivoting your focus,
Yeah.
but if like my personal goal is to become a professor, how much leeway do I have to just change where I'm researching?
Like 100%.
Okay.
Yes. I am limited only by my own like time and energy. And, you know, like the idea of like going to an area that's totally new is kind of daunting at this point, because it's like, I have so much knowledge about this one thing. But that's the only limitation. There's nobody telling me what I can and can't do research wise. Maybe around the sentence a little bit. That's
Yeah.
In general, what was feeling like the most difficult animal research?
Well, so the most rewarding part is definitely like just working in my lab with my students and like the team of people like that. I really, really like the sort of team science thing. Difficulty, I don't know. I mean, I feel like as I'm getting older or more advanced, I don't know what I'll just say older, because as I'm getting older, I feel like a lot of things around sort of like statistics, data visualization, programming, are changing really, really fast. And so I've gotten to a point where, and once you're like teaching and doing research and managing students, it's like really hard to have the time to sort of keep up with everything. So I've gotten to a point where, at least in terms of like statistics and data visualization, like my grad students actually know way more than I do, which is great, but it's also like a little bit disconcerting because sometimes I'm just like, okay, I need to do this thing and I don't know how to do it. And I need to find like one of you to like help me figure it out. And there's also like a level of trust that comes with that. I mean, I now publish papers where it's like, I didn't do these analyses entirely myself. So I think that's been a bit of a challenge that I just didn't really anticipate. I sort of had this idea, I think, when I was in grad school that was like, oh, some of these faculty are so like out of touch. Like, I'm gonna just stay current on like new things as they come out. And it turns out that's like kind of impossible. So I'm realizing that maybe that's just like the cycle of life in a way, right? That like at some point the younger people know more. And there are things that I have experience with that they don't. I mean, it's not like I, don't have knowledge that can help them, but like in terms of just like new things, they are far ahead of me at this point. It's been a little bit challenging, I would say. Yeah.
Other folks, we'll go to Lance.
So I know you said that what you research in like grad or in like undergrad doesn't exactly like shape or doesn't exactly mean that you have to research the same thing in graduate school. For you, if you did undergraduate research, did that kind of like shape and like lead you in what you decided to research?
It did. I went to a tiny college called Belmont University. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's in Nashville. And so it's not a research oriented university. So like I did like a senior thesis project because everybody did. But it wasn't like I worked with a lab or anything like that. So I had a job outside of that working in a research lab at Vanderbilt that had nothing to do with what I wanted to do. That was just like a paid job, but it looked really good when I applied for grad school because I could say like, oh, I worked in a research lab at Vanderbilt. But my senior thesis project was about implicit bias. But it wasn't like I was working with somebody who was doing that kind of research. It's just what I chose for my senior thesis project. Yeah.
Tara Peralt asks, in the article Bias Within, there was mention about a multitude of emails that were defensive about the results.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that? Are there strategies you use to mitigate the defensive response?
Yeah, that's a great question. So defensiveness is one of the things that I've studied a lot. Defensiveness is really interesting because on one hand, it seems like a little bit of defensiveness is kind of good, right? Because it indicates that like you've been challenged in some way or you've had to rethink something. But defensiveness to the point that people just like entirely shut down, we're kind of trying to avoid that because it tends to have these sort of like backlash effects. And so I don't know if the rest of you know, but what the person is referring to is at Project Implicit, because we have millions of people who visit each year, we get a lot of emails from participants who have questions. And my lab for a long time was responsible for answering all of those emails. And because of the IRB, we actually had an ethical duty to respond to all of the emails. The ones that were just like straight up like harassment, we kind of just ignored those. But for many of them, I would say the response was just factual. Like, well, here's what the data say. Like, I know this doesn't feel valid to you, but these are what the data say. Here's some links. For the people who are just mean, it was a lot of just like, okay, thanks for sharing your opinion. Bye. Because there's some people it's just, you can't, it's not worth anybody's effort. It's not I don't want to put my grad students in harm's way by having to like read some of the things that people write. So that's kind of how we would deal with it. And some of it was just like, yes, I acknowledge what you have said and we're gonna move on. But where there is sort of like a misunderstanding or somewhere that we could correct the record, we would try to do that. And now somebody else answers the email, so I'm out of that job.
Good. Yeah, you have another question?
This is slightly more specific to the implicit bias project that we're working on.
Mhm.
So as Raymond brought up sort of with the well, it's slightly different. It's like predispositions for the test itself and for going to the test, knowing that they're taking an implicit bias test.
Yeah.
How do you take into account that that they might be really like altering their perception of implicit bias, knowing that they might have implicit bias and then alter it to fit the test?
Yeah, so one of the things about the test that's really great is that it's kind of, the point is that even if people know what the test is measuring, even if people understand how the test works, it's really, really difficult to control your responses if you're performing the test correctly. So like, if you're really going as fast as you can, trying to categorize words into the different categories, even if you know what's going on, it's really difficult to control. Pretty much the only way that people can actually control their responses is to slow down. And we can see that in the data, right? We can see that like these people are taking 10 times the average latency of everybody else. And then we don't have to use their data. So it's pretty easy to tell. And then, you know, there are people who are just like click the keys really fast. And like we can detect that too. So every trial has a latency. So it's really easy to tell when people aren't performing the test as it's intended. And if people are performing the test as it's intended, it's just really hard to fake. It's not impossible, right? There are some people who can do it, but it's hard. It's hard to fake if you're just really just categorizing. And so like that's kind of one of the benefits of it overall. The other thing I'll say about it, for those of you who have taken it, is it has with what we would call a within subjects design, right? So everybody is their own control group. So it's like, you know, people will say things like, well, what if I just don't read very fast? Or what if it's like, takes me longer to recognize the words on the screen? That's fine, but that's true regardless of whether men and family go together or whether women and family go together, right? So maybe your overall times are slower than other people's, but we can still look at the difference between the two different sections of the test. And so that's what we mean when we sort of say everybody is their own control group, that, yeah, there's individual differences in reading speed, and like people who play computer games a lot might be generally, you know, sort of better at it, but that's true in both of the conditions of the test, not just one. Yeah.
Sophia from the online asks, general question not related to social psychology. Is it better to look for research opportunities that are unpaid due to any possible bias paid research opportunities can have?
No, I mean, I think if you can get paid to do research, do that, right? I mean, no reason not to get paid. I think that's, you know, a benefit to you if you can get paid. I think it also, I don't know if it necessarily looks better, but maybe a little bit, because I think generally paid opportunities are more competitive and people recognize that. So I think if you can say like you got a paid research assistant position, it's maybe like slightly more prestigious, but there also aren't very many of them. So don't like stress out if you can't get one of those. Yeah, I mean, I think the whole system of like our whole field relying on like unpaid labor of undergraduates is, I don't love it as a system. I think it's one of the reasons why I try really hard to like mentor the undergrads in my lab as much as I can and to help with things like grad school applications, because it feels like that's the least that I can do for people who like, yeah, you're getting course credit if you want it. But it still feels a little, just a little potentially problematic. So I think for many of us who care about that kind of stuff, we try to give back to the people in our lab in other ways, even if we don't have the money to pay our research assistants.
Yeah.
How long did it take from when you first started researching implicit bias to like the launch of the website and interpreting that data? Like, what was the form?
Yeah, so the website, I started grad school right as the website was launching. So I was not involved in the launch of the website, although I did start analyzing data from the website very, very quickly. I think it was like maybe 2 or 3 years between when, I started working with the data in grad school and when I got my first publication. So I think my first publication was like my 3rd year of graduate school, something like that. Which is, and that's like everything went really well, right? Like the first project like worked and was interesting. And so, one of the things we tell our grad students a lot is like really to like hit the ground running, because the process of doing the research and analyzing the data and writing it up, the publication part, it takes such a long time that to be able to leave a graduate program with publications, like you pretty much have to start immediately just because of the timeline.
Go to another online question. Catherine Dobosh asks, or to the states, I'm very interested in your study on weight-related beliefs and fat identity. How did you become interested in this topic? Where did the idea arise that some of these beliefs might be tied to race?
Yeah, so that is a study that was led by one of my graduate students. So I was a little bit just along for the ride on that one. There were, one of the things about Project Implicit, I was saying, we get all these data, we also make them publicly available. So like anybody can look at the data. And there were all these papers coming out about sort of like weight-related beliefs and prejudices. But what we were finding is that they never really accounted for participant demographics at all. So like, given that, 75–80% of the samples in, the papers that we were looking at were predominantly white, it kind of seemed like what we were looking at, actually, we were calling it weight-related beliefs, but it was really white people's weight-related beliefs about white people, right? And so my student really wanted to take kind of a more intersectional approach and see like, well, maybe within women, people have different kinds of weight-related beliefs based on their own race or ethnic identity, which is something that we found, right? There's actually quite a lot of variation in how stigmatizing it is to be overweight depending on race. And so that was one of the first papers really like looking at weight attitudes among people, specifically for the purpose of looking at people of different races.
Sarah Garfield asks, initially, did you receive any criticism for your research within the field of social psychology? And if so, how did you deal with criticism?
Yeah. We still get a lot of criticism. There are people who aren't really into the idea of implicit bias. And it's interesting because we get this from kind of like 2 different directions, right? And I think these are all fair criticisms. We tend to get sort of, I'll just use conservative for like a shorthand, but there's sort of a conservative group of people within social psychology who are basically like, you're making something out of nothing. This isn't really a problem. We don't need to be talking about bias all the time. And then there's sort of a more kind of like progressive group of social psychologists who are basically like, by talking about individual level implicit biases, you're ignoring things like racism and structural inequality and oppression. And so it's kind of interesting to sort of like from 2 very different perspectives, get these sort of criticisms that like implicit bias is not the thing to look at. And so, and those are, neither of those are like super dominant themes within the field, right? I think people on the right are kind of a fringe group within the field. And people who are more sort of like looking at structural racism and things like that, I think we have paid more attention to those criticisms and have started to do a better job trying to integrate individual level biases with kind of bigger, broader societal problems. So yeah, how do you cope? I don't know. I mean, part is like just ignore, part is like freak out a little bit and then try to get over it. Tell yourself you shouldn't freak out. But then sometimes criticism is justified. And I think sort of like keeping an open mind to that and thinking like, okay, we probably could do a better job of like thinking about the structural implications of implicit bias and then like doing that work. So yeah, I think combination of ignoring, changing, and then just like panic that you try to control, and then, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yes.
Where did like this undergrad student assistants, like, how do they hear about the project and how do they?
Yeah, so most of my students in my lab, not all, most of them take my intro social class. So it's like, they take an introduction to social psychology class and then they're like, oh, hey, do you have openings for research assistants? So that's for most of it. And then there gets to be like word of mouth, so people will like tell their friends. There is a page on the psychology department webpage that's like about research opportunities for undergrads that like says what labs use undergraduate research assistants. I've heard complaints that it's a little bit out of date. So like labs are listed as being open and then people write and they're like, no, we don't have any open spots, but that is something to check. I mean, it at least tells you which labs typically do have undergraduates working in the lab. So that, and then just taking classes and like asking the professors of the classes if they have open spots.
Good. Time for one more, yeah.
How would you recommend balancing time in the lab and social media?
Yeah, you know, I think that at this stage in your career, it's really just, you know, be in the lab as much as whatever the requirement is and like, don't worry about being in the lab. I think, you know, there's plenty of time in the future to like spend all your time working in the lab. I think, you know, most faculty will recognize that as an undergraduate, like, there are other things that you like should and could be doing in addition to that, so.
One more question if someone has. I know I said the last question was the last question. What do you all think? You're off the hook, but we have a couple minutes.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say, last year when I was trying to find research positions in the lab, I emailed a bunch of people and they're like, we haven't been taking research students for 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah, well, COVID also kind of shut things down. I mean, a lot of what happens in psychology studies is like, we have this whole undergraduate research pool and research, you know, undergraduates come into the lab and undergraduate research assistants like, you know, walk them through whatever it is they're supposed to be doing in the lab. And lots of labs just completely shut down for the last couple of years. So I think that's just kind of, you know, there haven't been as many people needed to work in the labs. And I think that's starting to come back a little bit. At least this is the first semester since 2020 that like my lab is operating fully in person. So I think other people are kind of in that situation too.
Yeah, so actually, I go back to the project implicit, and the, talk. There's a lot of like change in biases, especially with like major like movements such as Black Lives Matter and like
Right.
what happened with that. So do you guys like take into like, because I know you said you guys work with like political science professors and other researchers for like maybe reproductive rights, but what about like these bigger movements on like a larger scale and how they affect like our conceptions of life nowadays as opposed to our implicit biases that we learned when we were young?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there have been several papers looking at sort of like specific, you know, like kind of current events and how those have influenced people's biases. It's really hard to do because for something like, you know, a Black Lives Matter movement, it's sort of hard to know like what are the parameters of that, right? So I think, you know, there have been papers that sort of use like the murder of George Floyd as like a starting point. But then it's sort of hard to know what is the time period of that, right? And a lot of like big movements have this issue where it's just sort of like hard to nail down like what is the time period that we should look at. But there have been a few things. You know, there's a paper that showed that race bias declined, Black-white race bias declines in the months right after President Obama was elected, for example. So that's kind of an example of like a thing that happened. There was a current event that then shifted attitudes, at least temporarily. It's harder to kind of look at long-term change, but that's one example that people.
I know you have a class to get
I
to,
do.
so I wanted to end a few
Thank
minutes
you.
early, but thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck. Feel free to reach out if, you know, you wanna talk more, or learn more about the research you do.